Jerusalem under the high priests. 5 lectures on the period between Nehemiah and the New Testament by Edwyn Bevan, author of the House of Seleucus, 4th impression, published around 1920. It's dedicated to a particular reverend. Preface. The lectures in this book were composed for popular audiences in connection with the Bath and Wells Diocesan Society for Higher Religious Education. It's probably Roman Catholic, and it is not the object to produce what the professed historical student would regard as new results, but to give in a few strokes the general outline and colour of a period which must surely have an interest for everybody who finds any interest in the Bible. Anyone who should come to a book of this sort for the elucidation of obscure problems or matters of controversy would certainly be disappointed. It is on such points, indeed, that a work intended for students would chiefly fix its scrutiny. It has been the author's principle to neglect them, and try rather to show in a connected sketch what is plain and assured. Many omissions, or things left out, which in a set history of the period would be unpardonable, will strike any specialist into whose hands the book may fall. And if he is inclined to ask, why at least did the author not give fuller treatment to this or that, the author could only answer that in the first instance the lectures were cast with reference to limits of time, and that afterwards the author felt that to attempt to remedy their incompleteness would be to embark on a work of which he did not see the issue. It seemed better that they should go out as they are, popular lectures, sketches frankly limited in their scope, than make any pretense to be a complete historical manual. It seemed to the author that even as such they might be welcome to some of those people who, without being experts, are still interested in a period so crucial for the history of our religion, or the religious faith. Christianity, right? Basically. Especially when the author reflected that were he asked to mention any book which gave some brief account of it in accordance with the present state of expert opinion, he would be somewhat at a loss to name one. Those who wish to make a serious study of the period will of course go to the books which give them a command of the learned literature of the subject. It is hardly necessary, even in England, to name the great cardinal work of Dr. Emile Scure. The study of the more distinctively religious currents of the period has been greatly furthered and facilitated by the work of Professor R.C. Charles, the recognised authority upon Jewish apocalyptic writings. The author could wish that his translation of the Book of Enoch, were published in a popular form which would make it more known, as it ought to be, by all those who desire light upon the New Testament. It is from this translation that the author need hardly say, or have said, that his quotations from Enoch were taken. The quotations from the Psalter of Solomon follow the versions by the Bishop of Winchester and Mr. M.R. James, Ryle and James. The author has tried, in making this sketch, to see things for himself, to reproduce such an image as is made upon a fresh mind by his documents. At the same time, he had been continually conscious in that era of him writing this, of his debt to the writers whose works have taught me, that he gives a acknowledgement to them. Contents page and index. The Hasmoneans, here's a chronological or genealogical rather family line. Okay. Hasmoneans, and then Seleucid dynasty. Jerusalem under the high priests, chapter 1. The end of the Persian period and the Macedonian conquest. The Jew, the imperishable wanderer of the earth, is basically a nomad. It is among The strange contradictions he embodies that none of the planted nations is attached by a more passionate, a more sacred devotion to a particular soil. Centuries of exile have not worn out the love with which his heart turns to a certain little district of arid hills at the eastern extremity of the Mediterranean, the land flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands, the land which the Lord careth for, our own land. If I forget thee, this is God speaking to Jerusalem, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning, if I do not remember thee. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. It's either God or a prophet or somebody from Scripture. And yet this is the extraordinary thing. The association of people and land has never been in this case more than a temporary one. There are no autochthones, children of the soil, whose memory cannot show them a time when they did not belong to it. Israel's first entrance into Canaan was a definite event in history, so it happened. And recent discoveries even allow us to look into the land before the Hebrew name was known there. There are two periods in the past of this race during which they have, as a nation, had a footing upon those stony uplands. One, the period from Joshua to the Babylonian exile. The other, the period from that return of the Jews, which began under Cyrus, to the suppression of the revolt of Bar Kokhba by the Romans in 135 AD. With the first of these periods, most English people are more or less familiar because it is covered by the historical books of the Old Testament. But the ordinary Bible of Englishmen contains no narrative relating to the second period, except the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, till we come to the Gospels. In the first period, the Israelite tribes are mainly independent of foreign control. In the second period, the Jewish state is all through, except for one brief spell of 65 years, a subject state. It is with the second period that we have now to deal, and although in the imagination of most readers of the Bible it is little more than a blank, an interval of shadows between sunlit regions of the Old Testament and the New, it was in truth a period pregnant with great things, a period of supreme importance in the development of that Jewish religion, which, with all its good and evil features, confronted him who came at last to the temple of Jehovah like a refiner's fire, discerning the gold from the dross. Even for learned men, the years between Nehemiah 445 BC and the times of the Greek king of Syria, Antiochus Epiphanes, 270 years later, are not lit up by any Jewish chronicle. However important they may think it possible to show that time to have been in the inner development of Judaism, it is without strictly historical content. No such thing is possible as any record of successive political events. All we can do is to form a sort of still picture of the ordinary aspect of the Jewish state from what we know of its conditions before and afterwards, and follow those great world movements in which it was involved, together with hundreds of other peoples and races, the play of those forces which beat upon it from without. Let us first remind ourselves what sort of a world it was in which the Jewish community is shown us in the last historical book of the Old Testament, the book of Nehemiah. All Nearer Asia, all the lands we now call Asia Minor, Syria, Persia and Afghanistan, are ruled by a great king of Persian race, who holds his court in Babylon or in Susa, Shushan the palace, or in one of the royal cities of what we should call Western Persia today. But under the supremacy of the great king and his officials, the various tribes and petty states are allowed to manage their own affairs pretty much in their own way. Within Persia, yeah, but within Babylon at the time, under their foot, no, they couldn't. Cyrus was more flexible. That's why God used him to pull his people out of Babylonia by invading it so that they could practice their religion and come back to him. Whole pre-planned by God. Only they have to meet demands made up on their property by the king's representatives in the way of tribute or bakshish, more or less exorbitant as the case might be, some sort of tax, It was quite high, but they paid it to be able to do what they're able to do, wanted to do. So they had this bakshish, more or less exorbitant as the case might be, and to furnish a certain number of the young men to serve in the king's armies. The main preoccupation of the government in Oriental monarchies has always been to get in tribute and to maintain a strong army. So long as those ends are realised, it's not much troubled how the different classes of the king's subjects live. Israel then forms one element in the great aggregate of peoples embraced by the Persian Empire in the 5th century BC. But the larger part of the descendants of the old Israelites have been lost in the confused multitude of races. Only the Jews and the Samaritans still form nations visibly distinct, and the Jewish nation is coagulated in two locally separate masses. One, and perhaps the richer and more consequential, is gathered in and around the imperial capital Babylon, where they have been ever since the days of Nebuchadnezzar. The other occupies the city of Jerusalem, gradually rising from its ruins, and a belt of country rounded on the grey Judean hills. Yes, some jumped at the offer of going back to Jerusalem and repairing the temple, the destroyed temple. There's money and materials given by Cyrus at the time, so some went back, the others said, nah, we're going to go back there. So they remained in Persia, supposedly. The return from exile was never more than partial. Many families were comfortably settled in rich Babylonia, and worldly considerations were not overborne by such feelings as those which moved the psalmist. One thing I have desired of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. But the Babylonian Jews were nevertheless keenly interested in the fortunes of the community at Jerusalem and of the holy city. If they themselves only went occasionally to worship the Lord in his temple, much, no doubt, of their money found its way to Jerusalem. The book of Nehemiah shows us one of these Eastern Jews who had risen to a place of influence in the royal household, appearing at Jerusalem in the guise of reformer and organizer. His work is summed under two heads. He directs the rebuilding of the city's fortifications so that it may resist the attacks of the neighbouring races. For we must remember that under the loose Persian rule, one city or tribe might often harry another without moving the imperial government to action. So one might hassle the other one, bug them, right? Goad them on. And he readjusts the social relations of the community, especially enforcing the religious law which forbade the intermarriage of Israelites with the daughters of the Gentiles, or non-Jews or foreigners, or non-Israelites. We need not now go further into his story or discuss the questions raised by his rather problematical connection with Ezra the scribe. With Nehemiah, the historical narratives of the Old Testament end, and a cloud covers Jerusalem and its people for nearly 200 years. How are we to think of the people living and being governed in that unrecorded time? And first, who was the chief of the Jewish state? In the early days of the return, we find a civil and a religious chief ruling side by side. Zerubbabel, a descendant of the old royal family, and Joshua the high priest. Zerubbabel has his place in the framework of the great king's government by his being clothed with the authority of local governor, or Tershatha. But this double headship did not go on. The house of David disappears from sight. The high priest presently holds the supreme office without a rival. Of course, when Nehemiah carried through his reforms, he intervened as the great king's representative, as Tershatha or Peha, and his authority overrode that of all other persons in Jerusalem. But before the clouds which comes down after Nehemiah again lifts, the Jewish state has only one chief, the hereditary high priest. Into what various orders the ruling and judging classes fell, we cannot say with any precision or exactly. Or precisely, right? In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we find four terms used to describe them: princes, Sadim; elders in Hebrew, Zekinim; Ezra 10:8 in Aramaic, Sabaya; Ezra verse 5, rulers, kohanim, and nobles, horim. But what exactly each of these names implied, whether any of them, princes or for instance the nobles, coincide in meaning or whether their meanings overlap, it is impossible from the vague character of the references to make out. Certain things, however, appear. Firstly, that this community at Jerusalem was no democracy. The administration was in the hands of aristocratic class. Secondly, this aristocracy was to some extent one of blood, consisting of the heads of the different families, fathers' houses, and there's a footnote below, and it says, have a look at 1 Ezra 8:29. Thirdly, in this aristocracy, the leading men of the priestly families, as might be expected in a state whose chief magistrate was the high priest, came sooner or later to hold a prominent place. In the 2nd century BC, a senate, in Greek gerousia, is definitely mentioned, over which the high priest presides, or rules over. But here, sits at the top as the boss, right? But here again, we do not know what to extent this body corresponded with the old aristocracy, or how far it had taken shape under the influence of Greek political forms. It is generally thought to be the same body, which later on was more usually called by another Greek name, Sanhedrion. So that's where that came from. Council, a term the Palestinian Jews in their language reproduced as Sanhedrin. What is important to observe is the ecclesiastical character of the Jewish state in the days after Nehemiah, as compared with the old Davidic kingdom. It is not a mere matter of form that its chief rulers are now priests. The distinction in human societies between the religious and the secular was never, of course, so strongly marked in ancient times as it is now. The sharp differentiation of church and state is really quite a modern step in human progress. In all ancient societies, religion was a concern of the state. The ministers of the public religion were officials of the state, and the officials of the state were in some degree ministers of the public religion. With all that, there was a difference felt between the functions which secured the people's well-being by what we should now call natural means, the functions of judge in general and statesman, and those which had reference to supernatural processes, to securing the connections between the people and the divine powers. Although these functions might be combined in one person, the kings, for instance, of ancient peoples were normally judges, generals, and priests in one. Still, the secular functions were more prominent in the king and gave it peculiar colour to the royal office. The religious function made up all or most of the business of the priest. When, therefore, in a community it is the priests who bear rule, it means that the securing of the connection with the divine powers has taken an unusually large place in the interest of the people. It has seemed a more important concern than the use of ordinary natural means, the exertion of human force and prudence, whereas in the ordinary run of states it was just the other way. The secular functions predominated in the chief magistrate, king or archon, or consul. The priests were subordinate. One may express this in the case of the Jewish state of these times by saying that it is contrasted both with the old Judaic kingdom and with neighbouring communities, in that it looks less like a state and more like a church. It was a development which we could see to have been naturally produced by the loss of political sovereignty acting upon such a constitution and temperament as that of Israel. But there is one thing which we may already remark at this stage as distinguishing this Jewish society from those societies in which a sacred caste tyrannizes the common people at its will and pleasure. In this aristocratic community there is an element with democratic affinities. Sir Henry Maine pointed out in an ancient law that it is a step in the direction of, or was a step in the direction of democracy, when all those laws and customs, the knowledge of which has hitherto been the possession of a privileged order, are embodied in a written code which he who runs may read. Well, from the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, the divine law was read in the ears of the people, and the Jew felt that the priesthood derived its authority from the law, and not the law its authority from the priesthood. So it's talking about the Mosaic law there. You see, and also Levitical laws, you see how momentous that was. Public opinion could judge the priestly class by reference to the written word, which was acknowledged by all alike to be derived directly from God, in a more literal sense than that in which it was said of the Greek republics. It might be said of this Jewish community that it knew no sovereign or flesh, that law was its king. And as we go on, we shall see how the old aristocracy had to give place to this greater power, how the priest came to be overshadowed by the scribe. But meantime, while the priests had to acknowledge the derivation of their privileges from the law, what they derived was something very substantial. They drew into themselves a steady proportion of the riches of the people. It was not only a privileged position which the law gave them, it was material wealth. You have only to turn to the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy to see this. Every meal offering, every sin offering, every trespass offering brought by the people became theirs. And here's the verse to check out below, indicated by that footnote. Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. In the case of some other offerings, the priest received a part of every animal sacrificed. Again, look at the footnotes below for those particular verses. When the Palestinian Jew gathered in his corn, his vintage, his figs, his pomegranates, his olives, or his honey, the first fruits had to go in a basket to the temple in Jerusalem. When the first fruits had gone, and these indeed did not amount to more than an inconsiderable specimen of the produce, he had to proceed to the more serious deductions. All the best of the oil, and all the best of the vintage and of the corn had to be set apart for the priests. This was described by a Hebrew word, teruma, which our Bibles translate, not very happily, by heave offering or heavy offering. The proportion of the teruma to the whole yield ought, according to the Jewish tradition, be from a 60th to a 40th, like 60% to 40%. But even this was not at all. After the tumra had been deducted, a tenth of the crop had to be taken out as the due, or as a payment, not of the priests in the first instance, but of the lower orders of temple ministers, the Levites. But the Levites had in their turn to pay a tenth of this tenth to the priests. Numbers 18:20. With the payment of the tenth of his corn, the Jew had not yet satisfied all the claims of the priest upon the fruit of his ground. When he went on to make his corn into bread, one loaf in every 25 was the priest's. For that indication in some verses down the bottom here, throughout Numbers, Deuteronomy, and even Malachi 3:9, Nehemiah 13:10. Besides this, the firstborn of all his domestic cattle, or a money indemnity for the firstborn according to circumstances, had to go to the priest. His firstborn son had to be redeemed at the age of a month by the payment of 5 shekels, about 13 shillings in our money. That's in British currency. Whenever he killed an animal for his own food, the shoulder and the 2 cheeks and the maw belonged to the priests. Whenever he sheared a sheep, the priests were entitled to a proportion of the wool. At a moment of crisis, a man might seek to extort the help of God by a vow, by devoting himself or some of his belongings to his ox, his ass, in other words, his donkey or half mule, half horse, his manservant or maidservant. Or if his conscience smote him as to the way in which he had come by any of his possessions, it was the priest, failing the rightful owner, who received compensation or payment or reward. The priests, you see, were in a fair position to grow rich, and yet one cannot discover that they could, as a rule, assert their claims by force. The satisfaction of these claims was left to the conscience of the people themselves. This is what the Romans did, right? They said, right, give us so much, and then give us this, give us that. So basically people had next to nothing because of these high taxes and these demands, etc. The satisfaction of these claims was left to the conscience of the people themselves. It does not seem to have been so left in vain. We hear indeed complaints in the earlier period that the tithes were not regularly brought in, but in proportion as zeal for the law penetrated the Jewish people, as it did, ever more and more, punctuality in paying the priest's dues became a prominent part of righteousness. Fear the Lord and glorify the priest, and give him his portion, even as if it is commanded thee, the bread of the trespass offering and the gift of the shoulders, the offerings of righteousness and the holy tumra. We read it in Ecclesiasticus, and it's Ecclesiastes 7:31. In the book of Judith, it is represented as a thing which would call down the vengeance of God, that a mountain village far from Jerusalem, when besieged by a heathen army and reduced to famine, should consume the first fruits of the corn, and the tenths of the wine, and the oil which they had sanctified and reserved for the priests that stand before the face of our God in Jerusalem. Footnote, that's Judith 11:13. You remember how it is a mark of the Pharisees in the Gospels that he gives tithes of all that he possesses, not of corn and wine only, but even of mint, anise, and cumin. The operation of the same law, which so often brought the priesthood under the condemnation of the pious Jews, made its revenues extensive and sure. From all this we may get some notion of the general constitution of the Judean society in that dark period between Nehemiah and the 2nd century. We must think of it as quite a small society. The Jewish people had not the extension which is shown us in the days of Christ. If we had gone in the 5th century BC, through Galilee, through all those sacred places so familiar to us, Nazareth, Cana, Bethesda, Capernaum, we should have been among heathens. The name Galilee is the short for Galilee of the Gentiles. That is the region of the Gentiles. They must have gone in there and invaded it and created an authority over it there.